Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Science Fiction Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host today, Keith Cook. I guess I could give you my last name, right? So, welcome back to the show, everybody. This week we're going to be talking about a few different things. Mostly why I keep talking about the same science fiction franchises every time I go to talk about why something is good or where there's good symbolism, things like that. But we're going to start in reverse order this week, where we're going to talk about something that's on the horizon in the science fiction world that I am super excited about. And this week, what I am excited about for this year is the movie Bloodshot. Bloodshot is based off of a comic book series, and the comic book series is created by Kevin Van Hook, Don Perlin, and Bob Layton. It's in the Valiant Comics publication line, and it started its run in 1992, November of 1992. I would have been 2 years old. I was born in 1990. Obviously, if you can do math. Unless my birthday was in December and I was born in 89. So, two possibilities there. I'm not going to tell you which one it is. So, Bloodshot is, the main character is a former soldier with regenerative and metamorphing powers made possible through nanites injected into his blood, which is part of where the name Bloodshot came from. So, the character in the movie, played by Vin Diesel, he is killed during action and is revived using these nanites. But the thing that makes this really interesting, because I know on the surface it sounds kind of boring, like, oh, it's Captain America, but instead of super serum, he has a bunch of little robots in his body. Or in his body. It's kind of like the Michael Crichton novel Prey, which was published in 2002, and I'm actually really interested in reading that book. I love Michael Crichton. He wrote one of my favorite science fiction books, Sphere, which I actually did a project on in 8th grade, I want to say. I was super into 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, so Sphere was like kind of a modern-ish retelling of that story, but it involved aliens potentially, and there's some adult content in the book. So you can imagine, as an 8th grader, I was pretty pumped to read that book. But anyway, back to the subject at hand. So Bloodshot, the character, he dies. He is revived using nanites, which gives him superpowers because these little tiny robots will help, like, regenerate wounds, enhance musculature, and other miscellaneous performance abilities that Bloodshot has. But the caveat, and this is what makes it interesting, is that they also allow for the scientists who are working with this particular agency, who control Bloodshot, the character, to wipe his memory. So if you look up the trailer, you'll see Vin Diesel, who I think is an excellent pick. I love Vin Diesel in most of the just kind of like unapologetic action films that he's been in. He's just, if he's been typecast, his typecast is excellent for him. So I think he does a good job with this type of stuff. So the basic premise of the movie is that he originally wants to get revenge on the person who killed his wife. The person who killed his wife killed his wife because of his involvement in the military, because he was in special forces, etc. But as the trailer goes on, it's revealed that after he kills that one person who he thinks kills his wife, they shut him down, bring him in, and then wipe his memory, and then replace the person who he believed had killed his wife with another person. So he is basically a super advanced hitman. And the trailer kind of seems to play with the idea of like what is real to Vin Diesel's character, who can he trust, how can he gain control of his life, of his own memories again. And it just looks super cool, and I am really excited about it. So moving on to what it is, or the main bulk of the podcast today, I wanted to kind of revisit some of the stuff that we've been talking about in previous podcasts, specifically the franchises and stories and books that I have been referencing when I've been talking about some of these storytelling concepts and things like that. And I thought that now would be a really good time to kind of expand on why it is that I continually reference these particular stories or these particular movies. Well, I guess a movie is a story. So why I continue to reference these particular things. So first off, I want to talk about H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells is an author from the late 19th to early 20th century. You would probably be most familiar, or anyone is probably going to be most familiar with Dr. Moreau's Island, The Invisible Man, and War of the Worlds, and also Time Machine. H.G. Wells is considered by a lot of people who are in the academic world of science fiction and literature to be the father of the modern science fiction novel, even though he wrote pretty prolifically and kind of expanded into some other genres. And part of what makes H.G. Wells' books so memorable, and part of the reason why he's kind of credited with this idea of being the father of science fiction, is that he was one of the first authors to acknowledge something called the plausible implausible, or you would probably be more familiar with the term suspension of disbelief. This is essentially the idea that there is a level of buy-in that is expected of the reader or the viewer in order for the story to move forward. It's basically when you're watching Star Wars and you can say, yeah, okay, I can believe in the Force for the sake of being involved in this movie. And H.G. Wells' approach to this particular idea is seen in all of his novels because he's quoted as saying that you can only convince a reader to believe in one sensational thing at a time. They can only suspend their disbelief enough to believe that someone accidentally discovered how to be invisible. Someone has figured out how to travel through time in a linear fashion, either forward or backward. His basic idea with using science fiction was that people no longer believed in the idea of magic. So you couldn't explain those things through magic. You could explain them through science, hence science fiction. And he believed that the setting of his story was supposed to serve as this like relatable home base that you could return to, which is why most, if not all, of his science fiction stories are set in pretty relatable settings. They're places that you and I could visit as individuals, even though we can't do the things or experience the things that the main characters experience. And this could be intentional on H.G. Wells' part. It could also be that it's a reflection of his upbringing. H.G. Wells is a very interesting character. So if you're interested in learning more about him, I would recommend, his Wikipedia page, obviously. But in addition to that, there is a whole branch of academics that just studies H.G. Wells, which I think is pretty interesting that you could spend that much time on one person. But back to my point. So why I reference his work so frequently in these podcasts. Wells is a master of science fiction storytelling for more than just the fact that he can get us to suspend our disbelief and buy into the story. He's really good at creating characters who we can relate to, who have gone through some sort of experience that creates the science fiction world in itself. So we, as an individual, can understand what it is that the Invisible Man goes through because he accidentally becomes invisible because of his obsession with figuring out how to accomplish this task. The story of the Time Machine kind of has a similar presence where it's this obsessed scientist who wants to figure out how to do this particular thing, and he has all these other relationships. He has to prove that he can travel through time to other people, and he's a laughingstock at some point during the novel as well, and he gets into all these, I guess you could call them weird or fantastic situations because of his ability to travel through time using his time machine. But I do think that Wells' talent lies in the fact that he can so effectively solicit buy-in from his readership. If you think about the context of when he was writing these things, you think in the early 1900s, he's able to convince people and to create a timeless story about a man who accidentally discovers how to be invisible, or a man that creates a time machine, which is a term that was created by Wells. It's not as if time travel hadn't been played around with in novels previous to what H.G. Wells wrote in The Time Machine, but he coined that phrase that is now kind of ubiquitous when you're talking about time travel, unless you're talking about comic books, but I won't get into that. There's spoilers there. Anyway. And he's able to solicit an emotional response from his readers through our ability to relate to the characters that he has created, through our ability to put ourselves in the world that he has created. And he was able to do that not only with past generations where it was just unfathomable to think that there was an alien race that was going to come to Earth and destroy large swaths of civilization at a time when such a concept was just so outlandish. You have things like Cthulhu and these cosmic monsters that could hypothetically have come from outer space, but we don't really know where they're from. And those are all interesting storytelling elements, but it's Wells who's able to get us to believe that those things could exist in a capacity that we could understand. And that's part of what really separates him from other storytellers of his time and what makes him kind of the father of the modern science fiction story. So we're going to take a quick commercial break and then we'll talk some more about a couple other authors.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
GSMC Science Fiction Podcast. Before the break, we had just kind of wrapped up talking about why it is that I talk about H.G. Wells every week that I am hosting this show. I apologize for bringing him up so frequently. I just think that his stuff is super great, and we as science fiction fans don't read it often enough. So I highly, highly recommend you check out some of the shorter pieces that he has. The Time Machine is pretty short and easy to get through, as is The Invisible Man, and those books are excellent if you are a science fiction fan. And I think that there is just a whole untapped world of science fiction content in the realm of like actual like books that a lot of people as science fiction fans aren't familiar with, because ultimately, let's just be honest, it's easier to watch a TV show or a movie than it is to sit down and read a book. But I can't recommend those books enough. Speaking of books, we're going to talk about another author who I love by the name of Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury, you're probably familiar with because you were forced to read one of his books in high school. I know that most people read Fahrenheit 451. It's kind of along the same veins of George Orwell's 1984, except in my opinion, it's infinitely better than 1984. And that is because the premise of Fahrenheit 451, I mean, it's kind of meta in a funny way, because it's about a society that has initiated thought control. It's a dystopian society with thought control via televisions that double as cameras, which is a horrifying thing that is kind of happening currently. And we should have a podcast. I might even just do an episode on all of the things that have been predicted by people who wrote these. They're not post-apocalyptic, but they're dystopian future science fiction books. Like Albert Huxley wrote A Brave New World. Also, his name's not Albert, it's Aldous. I have no idea why I called him Albert. So we've got A Brave New World, we've got 1984, and we have, in my opinion, the best of those popular dystopian novels that you probably read in high school, Fahrenheit 451, which is just one of the numerous examples of excellent Ray Bradbury literature that is available to you. But Fahrenheit 451 is a really good piece of science fiction, and the Illustrated Man collection of short stories, as well as the Martian Chronicles collection of short stories that Ray Bradbury wrote, are excellent examples of science fiction because of Ray Bradbury's ability to take the human experience and put it into outlandish situations. Last week we talked about a short story where there was a religious individual who was trying to go and preach to these spherical light-based beings on Mars because he believed that they did not have any knowledge of the Judeo-Christian God. And that's one of the more metaphoric, kind of like ethereal stories from the Illustrated Man short story collection. So one that might be more relatable is this short story about these two children who are able to go into like a virtual reality room where they can experience all sorts of things from other parts of the world or from the past that no longer exist. And Ray Bradbury was writing this at a time when virtual reality was not even a concept that was on the horizon of technology. And now we can read it, and it has kind of like a similar impact, but with much more realistic implications, because now virtual reality is something that is on our technological radar. Like, you can go buy a virtual reality headset and immerse yourself in this world that doesn't exist, and that virtual reality headset will trick your brain into thinking that what you're experiencing is at least somewhat real, depending on your ability to suspend disbelief, of course. So back to the topic at hand. The reason that I am constantly bringing up Ray Bradbury and the stories that he writes as good examples of science fiction storytelling is, I think, probably the biggest part of it is because he is able to instill in us this fear of the unknown becoming known. So, for example, in Fahrenheit 451, one of the main antagonists is this robot dog that they use to sniff out books in people's houses before they burn those books or burn down the houses, and in one particular case, burn down the person in the house too. And part of what's so horrifying about that premise, both to people in the past who would have read it when it was first published and to us as readers now, is that it makes us reflect on how it is that what we think impacts the reality that we live in, and what kind of things get to have control over our perception of that reality. So Ray Bradbury is making the argument that books and education are the primary ways by which people are socialized into the world and learn about what is real and what is not real. And by controlling the flow of information through the education system, especially through books, this dystopian government is able to create a passive population who just goes with the flow. And in addition to burning these books, the government creates these media programs that are so consuming that it distracts people from the fact that they're really essentially being mind controlled by the government to believe certain things. And so we have to face the fear of this unknown. What if the government was able to do this to us with the power that they have because of the power that we give them as individuals to kind of like we give them our trust to do certain things in our lives and to run certain things. The unknown is like, well, what if that power was taken to an extreme? Ray Bradbury forces us to realize that, to actualize that concept in Fahrenheit 451. And he continually does this in a lot of his science fiction works. In The Martian Chronicles, there's this kind of hilarious anecdotal story of the last man on Mars getting in contact with the last woman on Mars, and the physical representation of like the space and distance that people in relationships go through. And it's funny because they go through all of the same things that they would go through even if the world was completely populated. They have the same arguments and the same conflict. So it's forcing us to face this kind of like known thing / unknown thing in a new way that is ultimately really kind of, I don't know if I want to call it terrifying in this particular case, but it is kind of scary to think that human relationships are so simple and so transactional that even though they're the only two human beings on the entire planet, they can't figure out how to get along. So to refocus, right, ultimately the reason that I talk about Ray Bradbury all the time is, one, I want you all to read those, especially Fahrenheit 451 and the Illustrated Man short story collections, because I think that they're really great and they give you just a profound look at what makes good science fiction and a really in-depth look at that, and they're accessible. But Ray Bradbury, his talent and what makes him so good as a science fiction writer is that he is able to portray things that are justifiably terrifying in a way that forces us as individuals to actually try to face those things and actualize those concepts within our mind. So we have just a couple more things to cover as far as stuff that I have referenced every week for the last, 3 weeks now. But we'll get to that right after this quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Science Fiction Podcast. Not that you would have forgotten where you were, but just in case you forgot my name, it's Keith. Right before the break, we're talking about, I was gushing about Ray Bradbury and how much I like the stuff that he has written, and I was recommending that you read it. We're going to talk about just one more author, and I'm sure that if you've listened to the last 3 weeks of me talking about different things in science fiction, you will know that we have not yet talked about Ender's Game, which is a science fiction story. I think it's a series. It's got several books in it. There are two different main characters depending on which part of the series you're reading. Ender's Game, the original, is by Orson Scott Card. And it is basically the story of a young boy who is... Well, I guess this could kind of fall potentially into that dystopian novel genre, because it is a dystopian world in which the population of the Earth is limited in their ability to have children, kind of like China's old rule of two. The individuals on the Earth are only allowed to reproduce if the government has told them that they want them to reproduce. One of the big things that makes Ender so unique is that I think he's the fourth or fifth child, which is 2 past the number of children that you're supposed to be allowed to have as a family, because this particular family had created their other children were so exemplary as individuals that the government wanted them to try again to make a child that was a little bit more balanced than the other children that they had and had been enlisted. He may only be the third. I may be off there just a little bit. But ultimately, that is kind of like a dystopian premise. And the reason that these children are being forced into military enlistment is because there is this threat from an alien species called the buggers/formics, who are infringing on human space, quote unquote. And these children are being trained in strategies, and I guess physical trials are a part of their training. So they're basically being brought up as children to be soldiers in this army to stop the buggers. And I believe that part of the reason that they're being enlisted as children is because the bugger threat is a certain number of years away. At least that's what they're told at the beginning of the book. And so they have to start training now so that by the time the buggers get to this particular portion of space where humans are, these children will be adults who are capable of fighting in this war. And one of the really interesting things that Ender's Game does that is kind of a common thread is this idea of virtual reality. And I think it's part of what makes the series so great. Even the battles that we get, the spaceship battles that we get between the buggers and the Earth forces, we're told they're being depicted through a video game. So this video game slash simulation is portraying what a conflict with a bugger's fleet of spaceships could look like. And then in addition to that, there is a kind of like a recreational virtual reality game that the children get to play in their quote-unquote downtime. And part of the reason that those things are so great in this story is because they serve as excellent places for symbolism and more in-depth meaning within the story. The primary example, I would say, is the Giant's Playground in Ender's Game, or really all of the interactions that Ender has with giants in general in this virtual reality game that he plays in his, like I said, quote-unquote, downtime. There are these fantastic representations of real conflict that Ender is going through in his life. And in addition to that, there is some kind of like supernatural seeming occurrences that are happening within the game that don't happen for other children, which is part of what makes Ender special ultimately at the end of the story. And while there are a number of factors that all add up to make this such a great story that I'm constantly referencing, I think that the primary talent, the primary reason that this is so good is Orson Scott Card's ability to take us into the inner thoughts and inner world of Ender as a character, and to create a setting in which we can ultimately feel very human, even though it's not a very human setting because of the outlandish science fiction elements of that particular setting. So the reason that I bring Ender's Game up quite frequently is ultimately very similar to why I bring up H.G. Wells quite frequently, because of those authors' ability to force us or trick us into suspending our disbelief so that we can engage in a more in-depth way with the story. So we're going to move on from Ender's Game, which again I highly recommend you read, and hopefully I will stop bringing up all of these particular references as frequently as I have been. And we're going to move on to Star Wars, which again, impossible to escape Star Wars. It is the ubiquitously acknowledged most popular science fiction franchise. It's just much more accessible than Star Trek to the science fiction layman. But we already talked about that in the very first podcast that I host. So if you're interested in hearing more about my thoughts on that, go back 4 weeks, to the, I think the podcast title is something like Star Wars, Why We Love It. And part of the reason that I will reference Star Wars quite frequently is because of George Lucas and the other writers who were involved, their ability to portray different aspects of the hero's journey, both within the individual chapters of the story, i.e. like episode 1, episode 2, as well as within the overall story, the meta-narrative of that particular franchise. In fact, they are so good at using all of these storytelling elements that when you're talking about the original trilogy, in my opinion, it's hard to know which one has which thing in it, because you're just, all of it kind of flows so seamlessly together. Each movie has within it the fullness of a hero's journey, and then all 3 movies together also have the fullness of the hero's journey. And like I mentioned in that particular episode, the hero's journey is a ubiquitously good storytelling mechanism. And of course there are, similar to Ender's Game, there's a slew of other reasons that I think that Star Wars is ultimately a good example of good science fiction storytelling. But we're going to move on real quickly to the last thing that I reference frequently, the Alien franchise, the original film by Ridley Scott, and all of the subsequent films. I talked a lot about Prometheus last week, which excellent film. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. I think that the Alien series does something similar to what Ray Bradbury does, where it actualizes this aspect of the unknown in a way that is terrifying and accessible to us as individuals, because it kind of brings the terror of the infinity of space into a being that we can ultimately imagine ourselves having an encounter with. That being the xenomorphs. And also what that series does very effectively is talk about universal aspects of the human experience and the consequences of those aspects when there are other things for us to interact with outside of the immediate world that we know around us. And the terror that causes within us ultimately is what solicits so much engagement from people into that particular series. And of course, these are just a few of the numerous reasons that I continue to reference all of these particular stories. Another one of those reasons is because these have stuck out the most to me in my journey through fandom of science fiction. I have definitely seen and read other works of science fiction. There's other good movies out there aside from the Star Wars series and the Alien series, or Annihilation, which is another film that I've referenced several times. And if you haven't watched it yet, you should definitely watch it. I highly recommend it. But the reason that these things stick out is ultimately because of their ability to engage with things that are familiar to us as individuals. And that's what I keep talking about with the idea of the human experience, which is this kind of ethereal idea that people talk about in the storytelling realm of how can we capture things that are familiar to individuals and portray them in a way that is both accessible and sensational at the same time, because we have to tell a story. Ultimately, part of what makes us love science fiction is the fact that it experiments with things that we don't know. One of the main facets of science fiction is that it presents the consequences of things to us that aren't known. It explores, what if we could travel through time? What if there was a perfect predator that had been accidentally brought to a place where there was a dense population of human beings, and how would we deal with that? And then within that story, that sensational thing, there needs to be something that grounds us. And that's part of what H.G. Wells was talking about with you can only make someone believe something sensational, like one sensational thing at a time. That's why if Star Wars was about an alien, we as individuals might not connect to it as much as we would when it's about Luke Skywalker. So I'm sure that we will revisit at least some of these things later on. I'm hoping to move on to different references and different material in the coming weeks. And just to end the episode, I wanted to talk about something else that came out that's Star Wars related. Aside from the fact that they've announced a second season of The Mandalorian, I still haven't seen the first season. I apologize. I know it's anathema on my part. But they just announced I believe it was the 7th season of the animated series, The Clone Wars, which is really exciting because the Clone Wars and the Rebels computer animated series have been a place where Star Wars fans got to see some of the extended universe that was eliminated from canon come to life. So I know that Admiral Thrawn is in Rebels, and he is a character from the Thrawn trilogy in Star Wars, which is, arguably one of the best extended universe series aside from the Yuuzhan Vong series of Star Wars, but we can talk about those later. But I'm really excited about this last season of Clone Wars because it will hopefully resolve some things that came up in the most recent Star Wars film, as well as things that had come up during the original seasons of the Clone Wars. So definitely keep your eyes out for that. If you're looking for more Clone Wars related content, there is a series of shorts that Cartoon Network did back in the early 2000s, I want to say, that is animated by the same team that did the TV show Samurai Jack. And each episode is only about 5 minutes long, but that series is really, really cool. I cannot recommend it enough. It's got a little bit of the history of Anakin. It's got Obi-Wan, and it happens between episodes 2 and 3. I believe that it's still canon, which is super cool. Because there's a little bit of an explanation of General Grievous in there as well. So if you're interested in more Star Wars content before The Mandalorian second season comes out and the season 7 of The Clone Wars comes out, definitely check out that series. really beautifully animated, excellent storytelling. So that's all I've got for you guys this week. Appreciate you listening to me gush yet again about all of these science fiction stories that I think so highly of. Just to review, I highly recommend you check out a couple books by H.G. Wells. The Invisible Man is one of the shortest, super easy to read. Check out Fahrenheit 451. Check out the Illustrated Man short story collection. And if you're listening to this, you've probably seen Star Wars. But check out that Clone Wars, the animated Clone Wars by the same team that did Samurai Jack. So thanks again for listening. Definitely hit the like button. Give us a solid review. Tweet at us. All of that good stuff. Thanks again. Have a great week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.